here when we baptize someone.
Right.
We pour water on them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then we anoint them.
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
anoint
With oil.
with oil.
Right.
And it all goes sort of like right back here.
Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot Van Hoy.
and Natalie Hill. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Hello again, friends. Welcome back to Cross Connections Season 2, Cover to Cover. We are bringing you today our 21st episode.
Boom.
Woo woo. 21.
Our
Pour some
podcast-
drinks.
Yeah, our podcast can have a drink.
Cheers. Cheers.
We're here today to finish out 1 Samuel. But don't worry, there's more Samuel to come when we're done with this, because 2 Samuel, as we talked about
There's
last
more
week,
Samuel.
is really just more Samuel. That whole problem with scrolls only being so long.
It's a long book.
It's a very long story.
31 plus 24, right? I think that's the total amount of chapters.
And again, not boring. Like, there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
No, definitely
You know,
not boring.
we're a long way from Numbers and Leviticus. You know,
a little repetitive at times.
Yeah.
Just because of how the stories kind of fold in on top of one another.
Yeah.
But,
we're also still, believe it or not, in transition, right? Like we just never land
not
this
in
plane.
Yeah.
transition.
I mean,
Yeah.
we're not far. We are about to establish a monarchy, and then it'll all fall apart pretty quickly after that. But and then there's a different kind of transition.
Yeah.
But we're still not there.
What are you talking about? I thought Saul is a king. Haven't we made the transition?
But yeah, I mean, Saul is a transitional figure. You know, we were talking about this before we went live, as we usually do. He's a king, but he's also sort of in the mold of the judges, the chieftains.
Right.
Like he's kind of got a foot in both camps.
Right.
There are some of the trappings of a king that he doesn't quite have. Like, it's not automatically assumed that one of his sons is going to take the throne after him. He doesn't really have a throne. There's no palace. There's no courtiers.
Yeah.
I mean, he's still a shepherd boy at some points in that story from last week.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so now we get this guy, David, finally coming
Yeah.
onto the scene.
Yeah, if you recall, at the end of last week's episode, Saul and Samuel had a big falling out. And God was also part of that. God also had said that Saul was no bueno, as Elliot said last week.
No bueno. No bueno Saul, as we call him.
So God, with Samuel's assistance, has found someone else.
Yes. A young boy from the backwoods of Benjamin.
The youngest son.
Bethlehem. He's from Judah.
Oh, yeah. Benjamin. I'm thinking of Saul.
Saul was a Benjaminite.
I'm mixing up my
but
tribes here.
David is from Bethlehem in
Yes.
Judah. In Bethlehem in Judah. Sorry.
And when there we go
Sing it again.
Here we
Sing it
go.
again.
Well, and I guess this episode is coming out after the Ruth one, right?
Yes.
Ruth was last week.
Yep.
Mhm.
So now we have some context of who this David guy is. The grandchild of Obed, the son of
Jesse.
Ruth. And ultimately the son of Jesse. And technically a line from Moab, which does not get discussed in 1 Samuel at all. So I actually don't know the answer to this. I'm curious if these are like different traditions. If Samuel has any sense that David's line is connected to Moab.
There's an interesting moment later in here, and I can't remember exactly what chapter it's in, but it's, if you haven't read along, you don't know what we're talking about yet, but hopefully you've read. So when David's out in the wilderness, at one point he brings his parents to Moab and asks the king of Moab to protect his parents
Yeah.
because he himself is under attack.
Right. And
so
it
it makes
definitely
you wonder if like they did know that there was some sort of connection.
right.
there.
It definitely resonates after Ruth. I had that same thought. But there's nothing explicit of like connecting the two. I'll have to look into that. We didn't talk about
I don't
this.
know that
Yeah.
question.
That'd be an interesting one to look into. But anyway, David, the youngest son of Jesse. Jesse apparently has all these other sons, which we don't learn about in Ruth.
Who get trotted out.
Yeah.
And each one of them is summarily sent off. Like, not the one, and then they're like, "Do you got any more sons?" And he's like,
Right.
"Oh yeah, I got."
Yeah, I got this other one. He's back home tending the sheep.
Yeah, what would you
Sounds
want
like-
with him?
Bring
Sounds
him
like
out.
Cinderella. Have you seen this moment in Cinderella where the person from the palace has the glass slipper, and then there's the
Right.
ladies at the household?
Couldn't possibly be her.
Are you sure
Yeah,
there
right,
isn't another
right.
woman in this household?
Right.
That's a good connection. Yeah, there's this wonderful line too about the Lord choosing David from 1 Samuel 16, and this is verse 7. The Lord says to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on his height, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see," and this is the rejection of the other sons, but the turn is, "The Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart," which is a great line. Pretty famous line from this book. A lot of people, one that gets quoted often. But we were joking before the episode. It's quite ironic because you go down a few lines and it's just like profusely praising how handsome David
right.
is.
Yeah, pretty quickly.
Like, wait, I thought we were looking on the heart here.
Verse 12. He sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes
ruddy.
and was
I
handsome.
feel like very specific, beautiful eyes.
Jonathan wrote this.
Yeah, clearly. Jonathan influenced that. We'll get to that. Before then,
we have all these like stories
Yeah.
of, I think are pretty clearly stories meant to like endear the population to David, not only at the time, but also in centuries later.
right.
You have the story everyone listening to this podcast knows, the
Mhm.
story of David and Goliath.
Yep.
You know, the little guy who takes on the big guy and
Right.
who and ends up beheading him. So
Through his faith in God.
yeah. And then there's the story where he gets sent off to bring back 100 foreskins, and
Yeah, right.
and he either brings back 100 or 200, depending on what translation
Right.
you are looking at. So he either met his quota or he exceeded his quota.
Doubled it.
Either way, it's quite a bit.
And then there's the song that shows up time and time again that Saul has struck down his thousands, but David his tens of thousands.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Like,
And this is really the turn in the story where Saul feels like he needs to kill David. And it's quite bizarre. It talks about like Saul had an evil spirit kind of overtake him constantly.
He was green with jealousy.
Yeah, he was. It almost reads in more modern frame as someone like with deep mental illness, like a form of like narcissism or a form of like bipolar disorder or some such thing.
Yeah, you definitely get that throughout. There are these moments when Saul seems to like, it's almost like he has some kind of an episode.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And like he's like throwing spears at
Mhm.
David these various times in these episodes that he has.
in chapter 19, verse 9, this bad spirit
Mm-hmm.
comes from God.
Yeah.
It
From the Lord.
but a bad spirit from Yahweh came on Saul.
Yeah.
So it's presented not as Saul went bad,
Right.
or it's presented as something that God was directing.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I feel like there was a few times where it was ambiguous, though that did seem to be the majority phraseology of like, it is a spirit from God.
Yeah, I mean, in chapter 16, verse 14, not long after David comes into play, it says that God's spirit leaves Saul and an evil spirit comes to torment him.
Yes.
But
and even still,
and
it's
it
an
was
evil
David's-
spirit from the Lord.
from Yahweh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So bizarre. I guess I'm wrong.
David's music that
Yeah.
calms the
Comes the
storms
Yeah.
beast
of-
within.
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's how he becomes so endeared to Saul
Right.
initially.
Initially. Right. He plays the liar before Saul.
There's a lot of interesting relationships going on here and then twisting of those relationships.
Mhm.
Saul is initially, when David is first brought to him to serve on his court, thinks he's a great young
Right.
man. The music playing helps him when he has, an episode,
Mm-hmm.
when God strikes him with that. Then the whole situation with David and Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
And then Saul puts David in charge of his armies. How old is he when he gets put in charge of Saul's armies? He was a young boy, too young to go into the battle with the Philistines. He had 3 older brothers who were fighting, and he's the very youngest. That means he has other older brothers older than him, but also still too young to fight.
Yep.
Right.
Is it just a child?
Well, sort of.
Yeah. Seems to be at the start here. But it's not very clear like how quickly this progresses in the narrative of like how old he gets.
Yeah.
I think there is a reference at the end of the story that he became king over Judah, or this might be the beginning of 2 Samuel. Sorry to jump ahead. At 30. And then it says he reigned for 40 years.
Right.
So to 70. So, I mean, before all of this, he is younger than 30, which even still is, I mean, quite young.
He'd still be hanging out with the young adult brunch.
I
here
know. I know.
At St. David's.
Yeah,
So
yeah, he would.
It is, by the way, canceled for April because it would
because of
fall
Holy Week.
on Holy Week.
Yeah,
okay.
that's true. Good reminder for all of the young adults that listen. But yeah, David, interesting figure, a musician, a shepherd, a poet, some would say,
a warrior,
a devoted follower of God. So careful about everything, the things that he will and will not do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he's just presented as sort of larger than life.
Yeah.
And full of life and vigor. He's like, the man of his time.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. He's like the Dos Equis man, the most interesting man in the world.
But much younger.
A little less gray.
And ruddier.
That's right. And he has this very interesting relationship with Saul's son Jonathan that begins in chapter 18. And it says at the very beginning of chapter 18, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And it says in verse 3, Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And this is quite unique because really, to my knowledge, I'm sure there might be a place here or there, this is just not how Scripture talks about relationships between people.
Nope.
I mean, we've seen so many marriages throughout Scripture and
nothing to this extent.
And you rarely even see the word love. In fact, I feel like there's something we talked about Samson. I think when we were talking about Samson, we were saying it's quite rare that relationships get described in vivid detail in the Bible. And that's kind of what makes Samson unique with his romantic relationships.
Yeah.
Such that when a lot of people read about Jonathan and David's relationship in 1 Samuel, there is a lot of questions about latent kind of sexual innuendo of what was really going on here. What was the relationship here? In a lot of ways, it is a political relationship. Jonathan is vital throughout these coming chapters of warning David about Saul's desire to kill him.
Right.
But there
an intermediary figure between him and Saul.
A huge intermediary figure.
And continually indicates that unlike the succession you would expect from kings, that he himself, though you would think in a kingly succession, that he, Jonathan, would
become the next king.
The next king repeatedly says, no, I know that you, David, will be the one who be the next king.
Which definitely is, to your point, Rick, about the Goliath story meant to endear David. I think this really presents to the reader, David is the chosen one. Like there's no question for the reader of like, maybe the house of Saul should have been king over Israel, right? Like, and we'll actually see this in 2 Samuel. Really what is a war begins between the descendants of Saul and David, not to jump ahead, but this kind of legitimizes like there is no validity to the house of Saul in 2 Samuel trying to take the throne. But yeah, some of the language in this relationship between Jonathan and David is really quite striking. Much later, there is a section where, let's see if I can find it here. They like fall upon one another in like rejoicing. It's in 1 Samuel 20. This is when David is hiding from Saul in the wilderness. They come up with this harebrained scheme of like shooting arrows, and there's this messenger boy and yada, yada. You might have skimmed through that, in which case there's no one that will blame you for having done that. But after all of this happens, it says David rose and prostrated himself on the ground. He bowed 3 times to Jonathan, and they kissed each other and wept with each other. David wept the more. And Jonathan says to David, "Go in peace, since both of us have sworn in the name of the Lord. The Lord shall be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." It's just like, you don't see this. This is really, I'm probably a broken record here, but it's a really unique relationship.
Yeah.
I would love to know, and I don't know, I would love to know how our ancient forebears would have read this, because it is just that unique and outside of their understanding of worldview.
Right.
So like, how would they have seen it?
Yeah.
And I don't know.
I don't know either. That's something that'd be a fun project to look into.
It is also kind of funny, that particular moment you're talking about, because they did the whole arrows thing because they didn't think that they could have a chance to actually talk in person, and then they end up in person together.
Right.
What was the point of all the arrows?
Right.
So you could just talk to each other.
In verse 30 of that same chapter 20, but Saul's anger raged at Jonathan. He said to him, son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Okay, he's his son too, but he's like, you're a son of a rebellious woman. Your mother. Don't know her. I know that you're choosing the son of Jesse. He won't even name David as David. He's like, you're the son of that woman, and he's the son of that guy. He's not even using names. That's how irate he is.
He's so mad. So what is also interesting when you talk about love and using that language of love, the language of love comes up in chapter 18:20. Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David. That's where the foreskins thing comes into play, because Saul asks for that as a gift for David to marry Michal. And
it's so overdone as a wedding gift these days. It's you know what I mean? Like, sign up at Bed Bath & Beyond.
I mean, grooms.
This again.
Grooms, have you ever been asked for a bride price like that? Probably not.
What's interesting about this, not to spoil it for people, but I'm going to spoil it anyway, so close your ears if you don't want it spoiled, is she ends up despising David in 2 Samuel. And the reason given is that effectively David danced naked in front of the people when they are establishing Jerusalem. And she comes to him and is like, who do you think you are to do this? You're supposed to be a king. And
you've brought shame.
Shame.
Yeah.
And basically the story just ends of their relationship with, and she despised him, and she never had any children from him, and then she died.
Yep.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So, spoiler.
Well, their relationship's a little strange because she loved him, wants to be with him. He's all excited about this, brings back the bride price, whether in, full or double full.
Yeah.
Depending on your translation.
Right.
And then later, in like a footnote, it mentions that she's given by Saul to some other guy to marry.
Right.
So how did that happen?
Yeah. And then she comes back.
And she comes back later, but not until 2 Samuel. But yeah, it's very...
And the other guy's sent off with like his tail between his legs.
Right.
Yeah.
And then
that was the end of chapter 25 that you find that out.
Yes. Yeah. A very bizarre moment where
it's because it's naming his other wives.
Well, yeah. And then this all happens in the midst of him taking another wife, Abigail, who was previously married to another guy as well, Nabal, who's this fool. And there's this bizarre story about like he disrespects.
What does his name mean?
Literally fool.
Means fool. Right. He is a fool. His name means fool.
He's an extremely wealthy fool.
Yeah. There's this funny line in chapter 25, verse 25, where Abigail, his wife at the time, is like, David, do not take seriously this ill-natured fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he, Nabal, a fool. Which is just, it's definitely a humorous story, I think, for the original readers. But in large part, this story seems to be situated here to explain we've talked a lot about etiology, like how things came to be, to explain how David happened to have this wife whose name was Abigail. And it's that he doesn't kill Nabal because Abigail intercedes, but then the story just ends with the Lord killing Nabal. And it's like, and then David took her as his wife.
Yeah. I think I wrote this down, 25:39. So, right, Nabal, not only is he wealthy and foolish, he's also really mean.
Mm-hmm.
So when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who has judged the case of Nabal's insult to me and has kept back his servant from evil. The Lord has returned the evil doing of Nabal upon his own head."
Yeah, right. And it's a bit bizarre because at the end of this entire story, the last verse of 25, David marries Abigail, which I love the line because, again, things are usually not described erotically or vividly when it comes to relationships, but it does say in verse 39, David sent and wooed Abigail, which I just wanted to highlight that because it is a bit unique. Like, wow, wooed her, this ruddy youth with his beautiful eyes. But the chapter ends with the verse, David also married Ahinoam. And I just think this is quite fascinating because what we see throughout 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is David is clearly polygamous, and this would have been very normal for a king. And we've seen this somewhat throughout Scripture and the Old Testament. But what's interesting here is that this is like no mark against him. There's nothing that is like, this is bad, or he shouldn't be doing this, or this isn't the way this is meant to be.
It's all mixed in with the other stories of David that are meant to build him up
totally
as this incredible national figure that we're all supposed to rally around. Like he's ready. He defeats Goliath. He gets his foreskins.
Yeah.
He kills his tens of thousands. He has a bunch of wives, right? Like, it's part of the legend of David.
Right.
That's part of the legend of David, and it's part of what you kind of expect from a bunch of kings. But I do believe that does go against what in Deuteronomy they wanted for the king. The king shall not, build up for himself lots of wives and children and whatever.
Interesting.
Well, it's going to get worse
Right.
with the next guy.
Right.
David. So we are going to, how I kind of read this is right here, it's not presented as a mark against him.
Right.
But like eventually it will be.
Right.
I mean, eventually the guy's going to take one too many wives.
Right.
And then his whole story is going to make a left turn.
Right.
And not go well.
So there's another section I really wanted to highlight, and it is the section where David is in the wilderness, which one I just think it's an interesting callback to Israel in the wilderness, these travels David has throughout the wilderness avoiding Saul. And there is a story in 1 Samuel 21 where David is still hiding from Saul, and he comes to, in the beginning of 21, Nob, wherever that is, who knows, to this priest Ahimelech, who's like the great-grandson of Eli, and he is hungry. He's with all of these men that have been in the wilderness. They've been fighting. They've been running. And he goes into this priest Ahimelech, and he's like, give me some food. And Ahimelech's like, I don't have any ordinary food.
I just have holy food.
Only holy food. And only the priest is supposed to eat this food. And basically David convinces him to give it to him, and he eats it. And again, this is like no problem at all, which is probably a way of showing that David is the chosen one. And I just think this is fascinating because it's a good reminder of why we are going on this journey, why we are reading these texts, because Jesus explicitly quotes this story in Matthew 12. And he does that
as a way to talk about commandments.
Yeah, as a way to talk about commandments, as a way to say, and specifically the Sabbath, because he's healing on the Sabbath, and all of these people are up in arms because like, who do you think you are? You can't heal on the Sabbath. And he says in Matthew 12, haven't you read that David went in and ate the holy bread?
Like a relationship with God is not about just blindly following commandments.
Yes.
Because sometimes you can break a commandment if there's a good reason.
Yes. Right.
And so Jesus will heal on the Sabbath.
Yes.
And David will eat the showbread.
Right.
And,
right.
It sometimes happens.
Yes. And what's also interesting in Matthew 12 is that Matthew is using this in that context to talk about Jesus as the Son of David, which is a title for Jesus throughout the Gospels, a title for Jesus as the Messiah. We'll talk a little bit more about David's relationship to this category of Messiah and how Jesus fits into all of that. But yeah, it's like David did this. I can do this. Yep. I can heal on the Sabbath. And it makes a deeper theological point about rules, which I think is a really good one. I was at the men's retreat 2 weekends ago, and someone.
How was it?
It was wonderful. Speaker was out of this world, world class. One of the best retreats I've ever participated in.
Elliot's getting a raise.
Name again?
I think it's Richard Morley.
Okay.
Some connection to St. David's. But someone asked me, and they said, what do you think about rules? And I think they were looking for an answer along the lines of, oh, rules are really good. We need rules. Rules are important, which of course is true. I mean, on a general level.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But I actually took it to Jesus, the way Jesus talks about the Sabbath, which is Jesus has this famous line throughout the Gospels where he says, was man created for the Sabbath, or was Sabbath created for man? And the point is, in the hierarchy of order, rules do not lord over people.
Yep.
People are put for Jesus over rules. The needs of people, the flourishing of people are put over rules in such a way that we have to look at the heart of rules. And I think this story illustrates that so well. I mean, if you're a real black and white view of the world person, you're like, David can't do this.
This is, in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, you are not allowed to eat this bread. Remember all those foods that were for the priest and the priest only. Some of them had to be consumed in the tent of meeting. They couldn't even leave the sacred ground. They were not for normal people, not for normal consumption.
Right.
But here, David and his buddies are hungry and it's all that's around. So, we're just going to do away with that rule for a second.
I was just going to say something about the things in my notes.
Uh-oh. What are the things in your notes?
Just about this whole argument about the people being holy. And what does it say exactly? The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is a common journey. How much more so today will their vessels be holy? And in the notes, they say that when they use the word vessels, that's
Innuendo.
innuendo.
Yeah. Right. Yes.
Also, interesting.
Biblical authors were not shy about innuendo.
No.
Right.
We don't we don't tend to read that into the Bible because
Yeah.
we're like, oh, this is not about that. But
It is.
biblical authors absolutely.
As we
did.
saw in
At
Ruth,
times.
As
when
we saw,
Ruth lays at Boaz's feet.
Right.
Feet
Right.
is not feet.
Right.
Feet is not feet.
Yep.
Feet is not feet. Yeah, it's a great point. Well, the story begins with, I hate to put it explicitly, excuse me if children are listening. The story begins with the priest asking David and the men, have you had sex with women?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Right.
And in this case, this seems to be a rule that matters where they really need to answer, no, we have not,
Right.
in order to be
Some,
able to.
some rules matter.
Apparently,
Yes, some of the rules are important.
Apparently, here, some rules still matter.
But this priest, by the way, in my notes also says that it's a grandson of Eli.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought that Eli's line had ended.
Yeah, the curse in the beginning of First Samuel.
Except the one that got away.
Yeah, apparently
Except
not.
the one that got
Ahimelech got away. Yeah, that's maybe a little more Bible math happening here.
Speaking of dashing rules, there's also the story of the Witch of Endor.
Mm.
And
Oh,
so,
what a fun rule. Yeah.
there are rules.
Sounds like something from Lord of the Rings.
I
The
mean,
Witch of
it's-
Endor.
It's so true. I mean, yeah.
Well, and she's not referred to as a witch in my translation. This is the Oxford annotated NRSV. Doesn't use the word witch. I think it uses the word medium.
Mine says ghost mistress.
Ghost mistress.
Isn't that awesome?
I want to be a ghost
Yeah, no
mistress.
kidding.
So there are rules in the Torah about like not consulting mediums
Yeah.
and not divining explicitly, like you are not supposed to know things that you don't know. And
this is something the other countries do, Like,
Right.
this is explicitly like,
Right.
don't be like them.
And in the beginning of chapter 28, verse 3, Saul had removed the ghosts and spirits from the country.
Mm.
So like
Oh.
Saul's like, we're not doing this anymore. And I don't know.
Or Saul had expelled the mediums and the wizards from the land.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But then
But then
we have this rule
he's
and now we're going to
desperate.
break it because
Yeah.
he is desperate and wants to know what is going on. So he goes to this ghost mistress, usually referred to as the Witch of Endor.
Mm-hmm. Which
And-
comes from the end of verse 7. His servants said to him, there is a witch or a medium at Endor.
Right.
And he asks for a ghost to come forward.
Mhm.
And the ghost who appears is the ghost of Samuel, who had died.
Now, she originally does not want to do this. She knows
Right.
that the king has expelled all the people. She's very
Right.
afraid for her life.
She's like, this is against the rules.
Right.
Right.
And if I
Some
get
of the rules
found
matter.
out doing this,
I'm going to die
I'm going to die.
Yep.
And then she ends up figuring out that she's talking
to Saul.
to
To
Saul,
Saul
the
himself.
person who has gotten rid of the medians. And she's like, oh, I definitely can't do that.
Yeah.
And
Right.
he's like, no. It's all good. I need to know this.
Right. Right. And then the ghost of Samuel comes up.
And does not give him good news.
No.
Well, I love what it is that he says right when he appears.
Why have you disturbed me?
Yeah, right.
Yes, verse 15.
Yeah.
Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?
Yeah.
And then Saul says, things are very pressing for me. Like,
right.
sorry, I had to wake you up from your nap, but I got an emergency going on. And Samuel basically says, you're out of here.
Like, why'd you wake me up to ask me this? I
Right.
told you what was going to happen.
Right.
By the by, you and your sons are dying tomorrow.
Yep. Not good news.
Now, send me back to my sleep,
Yeah.
my eternal sleep.
And like we talked about last week, it is still rooted in Saul's failure to wipe out the Amalekites. So this is explicitly what
The
Samuel
mark
says to him.
against him.
Yeah, it's like, you did this and there's nothing that can be done to ever overcome it.
And you almost like could be forgiven if you've forgotten about that. Because that was
Mhm.
chapters and chapters and
Mhm.
chapters ago. It was in the last episode. we
Totally.
did.
Totally.
Well, it was at the very end of the last. I mean, that was the whole big
Right.
reason for
God
the
said,
break between
wipe him out.
Saul and
Saul didn't do it all. And so it's the mark
so
against
Samuel. Yep.
him. Very
Samuel
similar
had to
to the
finish the
mark
job.
that goes against Moses when he
Mhm.
like taps on the rock twice.
Yeah.
And
Doesn't credit it to God.
And then like chapters and chapters and chapters later, it gets brought up again. Like, this is why you're not going to make it to the promised land.
Right.
Like there's these marks that happen against these huge figures and God doesn't get over it.
Right. Right.
And, and if he'd wiped out the Amalekites, then David wouldn't have had to rescue the people who got kidnapped from Ziklag in chapter 30.
Yeah.
Because it was the Amalekites that done it.
Those darn Amalekites.
It was. And then, interestingly enough, he defeats them and takes their stuff, which kind of ironic if you think about it.
But it was their stuff. Okay,
Right.
remember.
Yeah, true.
Ziklag is where he and all of his
all
troops
of his,
had been living.
And
That's
his
where
wives
all
are
of
there.
His wives, all of their
He's taking
wives,
back
all of
his
their
stuff.
children,
Right.
all of their donkeys. So yes, they take all of that stuff, but
That's
it was
true.
theirs to begin with.
Yeah. Good point.
Which is also why later when the people are like, we're not going to give the spoils to the 200 people who were exhausted and didn't come all the way. It's like, but it was their stuff. You got to give them their stuff back.
Totally.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it was like additional stuff.
Yes.
But
I'm with David there.
Yeah.
He deserves his stuff back.
Your big team, David.
There.
Just there. Yeah, not in 2 Samuel, right?
So this Witch of Endor, I think, moment is like the low point of the Saul story. This is where, Saul's kind of a pitiable figure.
I feel like the end is really the low point. But you think this is just rock bottom?
Well, I think it's rock bottom. Yeah,
before the end.
Yeah,
right.
His death is almost like an afterthought.
Sure,
it's almost anticlimactic.
Yeah,
because ends up getting a mortal wound, and he's like, I don't want those people to actually have killed me. So he tells his armor bearer to kill him, and his armor bearer's like, I'm not killing.
No thanks.
Killing the Lord's anointed. I'm not doing that.
Right.
And so he has to fall on his own sword. It's just like. Saul just completely falls apart.
It is a very sad, depressing death for Saul.
Yeah.
No blaze of glory, no, just peters out.
Yep.
Did we make it clear that throughout this time, so David's running around the wilderness of Israel and then eventually ends up, in Philistine territory.
We did not do this.
And because Saul's out to kill him,
Mhm.
right? A couple of times, there's like a couple different versions of the story where Saul's throwing spears at him, and one of them he escapes. Like his wife Michal helps him escape.
It puts an idol in his bed and like dresses it up with hair.
To make it to lie to her father about
yeah.
it. So there's a couple different versions of that story, and then there's a couple of versions about, Saul a few times got close to finding David, and David was still in hiding, like in a cave one time, and he cuts the cloak but doesn't kill him. And then a different version of the story, they get close to him at night and take his spear and his water jug instead of killing him.
Right.
And it's all of this. What's really
cat and
important
mouse.
about it, there's a lot of cat and mouse, but what's important is that David never strikes Saul or attempts to strike Saul.
Right.
David will not have any blood guilt over Saul's
right.
life.
He'll kill lots of people, tens of thousands of people. He'll get bags of foreskins, right?
Right.
But he's not going to do it to Saul because Saul is God's anointed.
Right.
And Elliot, you wanted to say some things about what anointed means.
I did. So throughout 1 and 2 Samuel, if you pay close attention, you will notice that, like you just said, Rick, it constantly refers to this idea of the anointed. And in fact, in this story we were just referencing where David and his men are in a cave, this is 1 Samuel 24, they're all like, this is your time. Like Saul has entered this cave to go pee by himself into the depths of this cave. And it's like perfect timing. And in fact, there's even a line like the Lord, they're saying to David, like the Lord has given him to you. This
delivered
is a
him
sign.
into your hands.
Into your hands. And he doesn't do it. He cuts off a piece of his cloak. This is a way to get Saul to forgive him. But this is what David says to his buddies who are really encouraging him. This is 24 verse 10. I will not raise my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. And one of the things we were talking about before the podcast is the foundation of the transition from judges to king is this ceremony Samuel enacts of anointing, of pouring oil over the head of the person the Lord has chosen as king. And this is where the word Messiah comes from, the Hebrew word Messiah. It literally means the anointed one and is synonymous with this role of king. So ultimately what we see is Saul is the anointed one. This is why David will not kill him. And then as it transitions from Saul, who's kind of this transitional king, it's almost like to the true and better anointed one, David, the man after, if you remember when Saul makes his mark, the line to Samuel from the Lord is, I'm going to choose someone who's after my own heart. And this is David. And David becomes for Israel, in the history of Israel, the emblematic anointed one, the central king, the figure of the leader of Israel, the one chosen by God, when Israel goes into exile, when the dynasty collapses, there is this hope for another Messiah, for another king, for the one that is going to come and rule Israel, liberate Israel, guide Israel. And this is really where the hope for Jesus enters the picture. Throughout the prophets, we get this hope after exile for another Messiah. And we were joking before the podcast, the Greek translation for the Hebrew word Messiah is Christos, Christ. This is not Jesus' last name.
Right.
This is a messianic title. It's just the Greek form of it. And so where I'm going with all of this is that Christians believe, like we've talked about when we talked about Mark, that Jesus is the anointed one. Jesus is the one sent by God to be the son of David. This is why the genealogies root Jesus to David. There's probably more I could say about this.
If I could just take it one step further and just say, you called us Christians. And so Christ means the anointed one. Us as Christians means that we are followers of the anointed one or anointed ones ourselves. And when we baptize someone, we pour water on them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then we anoint them. We anoint with oil.
Right.
And it all goes sort of like right back here.
Yes, it does. It totally does. Cool to know. I mean, again, this goes back to Jesus using this story earlier of David and his band. You cannot understand who Jesus is apart from this story in 1 Samuel about anointing and kingship, because what the gospel writers proclaim is that Jesus is king. And this is what that story is rooted in. Of course, as we discussed when we go back and listen to our Mark podcast, for anyone that hasn't, they ultimately really flip on its head what it means for Jesus to be the son of David, to be a king. And that's important to say too. A title throughout the Gospels is not just, we've talked a little bit about Son of Man, Son of God. The other really big one is Son of David.
Son of David, right. Yes.
And this is really important for Jesus's messianic role throughout the Gospels.
One of the things I find interesting in this story, so Samuel has anointed Saul, but God doesn't want Saul to be his anointed one anymore. And so Samuel anoints David, which happens right here at the beginning of our readings for this week. Chapter 16, verse 12. The Lord said to Samuel, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. Hold on to that thought. Immediately following is when the Spirit of the Lord leaves Saul and the evil spirit comes in. What I find interesting is that throughout the rest of this text, David has been anointed. David is the new anointed one.
Yep.
And yet David continues to treat Saul with the respect of being the anointed one.
Like once anointed, always anointed.
Once anointed, always
right?
anointed, right? Like ordination or something. And so continues to respect that throughout, despite the fact that he also has been anointed.
Right. That's a great point. It is a clear example of what Rick talks about with Saul as this transitional figure, where he is both almost a judge and a king. Like David respects you. Okay, you've been anointed. You are a king. This is not like a judge. But like the judges, there is almost this spiral that needs to happen first, where he needs to spiral out. And we saw that with the Witch of Endor and then his death, which is just falling on his own spear, which very much like the death of many of the judges is this just sad, chaotic, spiraling death.
Oh, yeah, because there was which one was it? Abimelech, where he got hit by the rock from the woman up high on she was in the tower. Yeah. And it asked his armor bearer to kill him with the spear instead.
So he wasn't
a lot like that.
Killed from a woman,
right?
Yeah.
And in this one, Saul doesn't want to be abused. He's injured badly enough that he knows he's going to die, but he's worried that the Philistines are going to get to him and abuse him before he's dead.
And he explicitly says, "I don't want to be killed by uncircumcised people." So again, there's this.
It's like I don't want to be killed by uncircumcised. I don't want to be killed by women.
Right.
Yep.
I don't want to be.
Very emblematic of some
like
toxic
honor, this honor of, strange honor. Like I need to be.
Right.
Yeah. But the respect that David holds for the anointed one almost kind of helps underscore the respect that's then expected. I mean, I think that one of the things, it's almost like gentleman's code
Right.
kind of a thing
Yeah.
where like, I have to respect this for you because he truly believes that this is what God has chosen, probably isn't aware that God's spirit has left
Right.
and all of that.
Right.
And therefore wants to fully respect that all the way through. There's got to be a piece of him that knows that as then also an anointed one himself, he would want the same thing done for him.
Well, I'm glad you say that because, again, kind of just spoiling a lot of stuff from next week's episode, it is so interesting to think about that Saul, and this is a famous story, so it's not much of a spoiler, but Saul commits this sin, and there is seemingly there's nothing that can be done to atone for this. And now you have David, the man after God's own heart, the true anointed one, but he does something too.
Yes.
And we'll just throw it out there because you'll get to it in 2 Samuel, which maybe you're listening today and you would have actually got to 2 Samuel 9, and it's not much further after that this week that you will read about David having Bathsheba's husband killed. He's confronted by the prophet Nathan, much like Saul is confronted by Samuel. And if you remember, Saul does repent. There is a true sorriness on Saul's part, and there is on David's too. And unlike Saul, for whatever mysterious reason, David is forgiven.
Yep.
Not without consequences. I mean, things certainly happen, but it's interesting that in this instance, in David's case, he is not treated with the same consequences as Saul of the Lord leaving him. So really interesting. Two very different pictures of how the Lord treats the Lord's anointed one. One, very retributive. The other one is okay, you've done this heinous evil. There will be consequences, but you're still the man after my own heart. I still love you, and your sin is forgiven.
Yeah, and that's not going to be something that's going to extend necessarily to the next anointed ones of Israel.
Right.
Because a bunch of them are terrible,
Yeah.
and God does away with them.
Yeah.
But David is a special,
Unique
special figure.
Yes.
So I haven't read ahead that far, but I am curious, and you all, as you're reading, look into this. Saul was specifically asked by God to do something, and he disobeyed what God said very explicitly.
Right.
So as I'm reading, what I'll be looking for is, did God explicitly tell David ahead of time not to kill Uriah?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because that might be the slight difference. There's some things you are and aren't supposed to do, and God won't be happy about this, but God very explicitly gave Saul a direction, and he did not obey that. And so maybe that's where the
direct contravention of a command of God.
Yeah, direct contravention of a command of God. I did find where it is in Deuteronomy about kings, just to refresh our memories.
Yeah.
So Deuteronomy chapter 17, this is verse 14. When you've come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you've taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set yourself a king. 16. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt, or in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. 17. He must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away.
Yeah.
Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity, etc.
Right.
It doesn't say, how many is many wives.
Right. No,
it does say that in here.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think it shows, as we've discussed many times, there are these different strands that present things in alternative lights and tries to make sense of them, where we see here in 1 Samuel that there's no problem with David having these multiple wives. But I think it is highly likely. So let me put it this way. There is a debate within scholarship about the view of David in 1 Samuel versus the view of David in 2 Samuel. In 1 Samuel, I think across the board scholars agree, David is presented in an immaculate light. There is nothing about David that even remotely glints of a problem. Now in second,
pure and
completely
trying to
pure
blood guilt, and
he
lies.
He
about
does no
harming,
wrong. Yes,
Israelites.
No wrong.
Mm-hmm.
In 2 Samuel, which is of course a continuation of 1 Samuel, but as we've discussed, there are different strands and traditions that are edited and brought together. There is a question of, are there strands within 2 Samuel that maybe are both pro-Davidic and kind of trying to explain problems with David? And it does, I don't have something to back this up, but it does make me wonder, based on what you read from Deuteronomy, Natalie, if this is the story of Uriah and Bathsheba trying to explain, oh, see, this is where things went wrong.
Yeah.
Like say the verse again. It's explicitly like, it even says something about the heart, right? Like the heart will,
Goodness.
if they do this, I know you're like having to flip through your Bible frantically.
I'll find it again.
I thought I should have paid.
Or else his heart will turn away.
Or else his heart will turn away. I mean, and that's really exactly the language 2 Samuel uses for David, that like his heart turned away. He displeased the Lord. Nathan has to come to him and tell him this parable that confronts him. And he kind of realizes in shame, like, oh, I've done this. My heart has turned from the Lord. And I think there's, you seem like you're about to say something.
So,
Rick.
yeah, I mean, we have these different, seemingly in the same scroll of
Right.
the book of Samuel, we have these different treatments of David. We're going to find another treatment of David in the book of Chronicles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And when we get
Which is
there,
the same story.
it's the same story.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same basic story.
Right.
But the chronicler's story does not mention Bathsheba or Uriah at all.
Right.
Not even a footnote, nothing. And so you can see how the ancient peoples, our forebears, like wrestled with David as a figure, set him up as this larger than life figure.
Right.
And then some groups were like, oh, but he's got some flaws.
Yes. Right.
And other groups are like, yeah, but we're not going to mention those.
Right. Yes. Yep.
You can see them struggle with that.
And
Yeah.
I think it's important to keep coming back to the fact that God does not want a king for Israel
Yeah.
other than God's self.
Well, one strand will
Right.
say that.
Well,
right. There is a strand that seems to be a little more.
Very anti-monarchical.
Yeah.
And then there seems to be like, yeah, not so bad.
well, okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
It's okay. Well,
Yeah.
God,
But yes.
in the way that it's described, God's like, well, you're going to decide to do this.
Right.
And
I'll let
if
you.
So I'll let you.
Right.
But I really don't want that.
Right.
Because I am God. I am your king.
Right. Right.
But if you're going to do it, I'll let you do it. But it's
Right.
not going to be great.
It's not the ideal. Yeah, the ideal is that Yahweh is the only king. They take direction directly from Yahweh. I did want to go back to this thing about the heart and David, and also just mention for people that might not realize this. I don't know. Are we going to do an episode on the Psalms?
Are you thinking of Psalm 51?
Yeah,
We're
Psalm
going to do
51.
lots of
yeah.
episodes
I
on the
knew
Psalms
you were
if we
gonna
go
go
by
there.
the reading
Yeah.
schedule.
So just as a very brief thing, traditionally the Psalms are attributed to David. We'll talk about, whether that's
Authorship
actually the
and-
case in
right.
authorship. But point being, it'd be interesting for listeners to go read Psalm 51 after this discussion we just had.
It's the great psalm of contrition. It's
Yeah.
the great psalm of I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm a sinner.
The famous line, "Wash me whiter than snow."
Yep.
Are you sure we shouldn't save this for next week's episode?
I know we should, and we will. We'll talk about it more. But it's just interesting to note all of this discussion about heart. And in verse 10 of Psalm 51 is the line from David after he has done this evil of murdering Uriah. "Create in me a clean heart, O God. Put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence. Restore me." All in the bigger picture of like, he gets to be restored in a way that really very few do.
Yeah, and so is that because of who David is?
Right.
Like a special place in history. Is it because of the tradition that Psalm 51 is a part of, that he repents mightily?
Right.
It's not a, oh gosh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry. I
shouldn't have done that. Yeah.
I mean, he rips his clothes and like,
Right.
I have done wrong and I'm
Right.
so sorry. And is it his repentance that brought him back in the favor of God or
Right.
kept him in the favor of God?
It's a good question. Good question for Lent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Cardiological event, someone told me.
gosh.
Rick's
of
sermon.
it.
That's a little
Rick's,
high.
Rick's
That's a
sermon
little
on that.
highbrow.
Yeah,
Right.
it's a little highbrow. Oh,
Yeah.
man.
Yes. So if you enjoy our content as not being particularly pretentious, go check out the sermons. Maybe you'll find some
Yeah.
more pretension.
Much more
No, I'm
pretentious.
kidding.
Go,
I'm kidding.
go.
That's not true. The
Not
sermons
at
are
all.
great here, and I commend you to them.
Well, I'm sorry for talking so much about 2 Samuel in our episode on 1 Samuel,
But
but
it just whets the appetite.
it does.
just
It
whets
does. It
the
gets you
appetite.
ready for next week.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because this whole 1 Samuel thing, you really get the establishment of Samuel, the transition to the first king with Saul, and then, you don't really see David as king yet. So it's just
Right.
kind of this whole, is he gonna be, is he not gonna be? It's really getting you through Saul's life.
Yeah.
First Samuel here.
Yeah, it is.
I'm curious. We've talked particularly about Judges and Joshua as being sort of examples in the negative of what we're not supposed to be like, and what we're not like. We're the great heroes of Judges are terrible people, and like God does not want you to be like them.
Right.
Has that shifted by the time we get to the middle of Samuel? Is David more of a figure that we could at least hear, emulate, or find something in that like positive that we could follow? Or do you think we're still dealing with like dramatically flawed person?
Interesting question.
I think even with Saul, I feel like we're getting more fleshed out characters who are a little bit more multifaceted.
Yeah.
Because Saul, as we said last week, he was just trying to do right. Some of the things he did wrong, especially when he made his first mistake of doing the sacrifices in Thanksgiving. It doesn't feel like was there really a heart problem there?
Yeah.
It's hard to tell. And then we talked a little bit more. We got into what Harem was all about and the real basis for it, about war not really being profitable. And that's why they didn't take any plunder. That's why everything was just killed so that nobody could profit. But it does kind of make you wonder, are these figures we're seeing now a little bit more mixed?
I think a lot of times the Bible presents, at least the early chapters, the early books, present sort of two-dimensional figures. This person's evil, this person's good. Right. And Moses, David, Saul, they're like real people who have both light and darkness in them, right? They have the capacity for great good and the capacity for great evil, like us all. And so in some way, like I'm able to identify more with a David, maybe not so much as Saul.
Yeah, but I do think by the time we get to David's really well fleshed out in terms of his humanity.
Complex.
Yeah, he's much more complex than I think a lot. Yeah, very human, Natalie. Yeah, the humanity of David. That does strike a chord, the realness of lived life. That is not black or white.
Yeah.
I do think, I'm trying to look here, David is referenced in the classic Hall of Faith in Hebrews
11.
In Hebrews 11, he's one of the figures that's named, though doesn't get a big shout out. Someone like Moses gets a much bigger shout out by the author of Hebrews 11. And Abraham, by faith, Abraham did all of this. By faith, Moses did this. And it's by faith the people of Israel did this. And then it just, in verse 32, the author of Hebrews says, and what more should I say? And then he lists, interestingly, some of the judges, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and then just in passing,
Barak
David
was not a judge. Deborah was the judge.
Yeah, I know.
Just gonna say.
And not listed here, which is quite interesting. Also interesting because
I interrupted your train of thought because it's like, he wasn't.
I had the same thought in my head. I was like, how are you not going to list Deborah? Arguably the only good one. Also, we talked about how much Samson stunk, and here he is as like a hero of faith. Also interesting because some scholars think the epistle to the Hebrews may have been written by a woman, which just makes it that much more interesting that she's left out here. We'll get to that in a long time. But David and Samuel are just mentioned in passing. It just says David and Samuel.
David comes up a bunch of times in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is a bunch of stories that are then interrupted by these large sermons by some of the great figures of the early church.
Right.
And they frequently give a salvation history view.
Yeah.
Start in the patriarchs. And David is, I think, in most of those sermons.
Yes.
And then comes back as a reference to the Psalm.
Right.
As an author of the Psalms. But like they really like hit David.
Right. Well, so this is what I was going to say. My bigger point to your original question, Rick, of have we gotten to a point in Samuel where we've turned from Judges is like, look, this is the bad thing. Have we gotten to a point where it's like, oh, there's actually something to emulate here? And my claim is that for the authors of the New Testament, outside of this example in Hebrews, by and large, the figures throughout the Old Testament, the patriarchs, Moses, Abraham, David, are not figures of individual faith for followers of Jesus. They're not people that, at least the way they use them, they're not used in such a way of like, look at Moses, look at Abraham, look at David, be like them. Across the board, they are used as prefigures and precursors to Jesus and as people that Jesus fills their role. Like even in our episode on Matthew, we talked how important Moses is for Matthew, and that Jesus does what Moses did.
He's like a new Moses.
He's a new Moses.
And then he's a new David.
Yeah, which is just a way of saying, I think there's something to be said that for the authors of the New Testament, they do not read the Old Testament as like, oh, you should, the way we often do, oh, you should emulate this figure or not emulate that figure. They always are constantly reading it through the lens of Jesus. It's like, how does this person show us Jesus? Which is just interesting. I think it's very different than the way many modern Christians read the Old Testament. Like David and Goliath is a great example. One way you could read the story of David and Goliath, and it's often used this way, is like, look at the incredible faith of David. You should have this kind of incredible faith too.
You go and slay your own Goliath.
You go and slay your own Goliath, which maybe not the worst reading. I can understand that. But I think the better way to read it is to say, read it through the lens of the person of Jesus. And how does Jesus, as the son of David, take on this role of David and do what David didn't do, which is to slay, for Christians, right? To slay the powers of death, destruction, evil, sin. So it's just, I think it's just a different way you can think about reading the Old Testament. That's maybe a little less like me focused. Not that you are not important and your faith is not important, but I think it puts things in a bigger light that I think is more interesting.
I also think the larger view is that God can use these larger than life figures who are also flawed.
Right.
Right. And so Moses is not perfect, and Noah is not perfect, and David is not perfect, and yet they all can be used. It's not, as you said, it's not just they have heroic personal faith and that's it.
Yeah.
No, they have some personal faith and they have deep-seated flaws.
Right.
They are sometimes incredibly narcissistic, and they sometimes work just for their own benefit and their own ascendancy, and yet God can still use them, be with them, and they can play a role in salvation history.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I was thinking about with the Gospels, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'll reread this. When Jesus is speaking, by and large, Jesus talks about what God is doing. Doesn't point back to those other figures. I mean, the gospel writers point back to those figures and how they tell the story about Jesus, but Jesus himself is always pointing people towards what God wants.
Yeah, he's
kind
not
of in the way that, why I was saying with this Old Testament, how in some of these Hebrew scriptures, God is saying, no, I'm the king.
Yeah. Right.
You're denying me it's almost kind of doing that redirection away from the human figures that God has worked through back to God's self.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. We're getting way in the weeds here, but I love it. It's interesting because this, I think, also speaks to, and we'll get to a lot of this when we're in some of these New Testament books, different strands of the New Testament in which some, like Matthew, which I keep referencing, are really big on this category of fulfillment.
Yep.
And so Jesus is the fulfillment of these figures and these events. Other books drive a bit more of a wedge. There's a little bit more disjunction to some extent with these figures, and there's more of a focus on newness. So there can just be a little bit of difference of like, it's not a massive difference, but a little bit of difference of understanding the relationship between these figures and people.
Yeah, there's the idea of Jesus as being the continuation of what God's been doing since the beginning.
Right.
And then the other strand that says Jesus is something completely new.
Like unexpected, new.
There's a new creation and we're starting at ground zero again.
Right. Yeah, which is not to say it doesn't view these figures as still important, but it changes it a little bit.
So, a couple of things for you all as we close out here. We're going to do an episode on the Gospel of Luke. I'm not going to promise you a date right now because scheduling is always fun for the three of us. But soon we will get you that episode on the Gospel of Luke that we know you all have been asking about. And I'm also going to throw something else out there because we haven't heard from you folks in a while. And we desperately
I'm crying at night.
Love hearing from you.
Yeah.
Your questions, your comments, email them, call in. In particular, we've tossed this about, and I did not give Rick or Elliot any warning. But I would love to know from you all, please contact us in the ways that we have given you to contact us. Would you like to see us record a podcast episode in person?
I definitely want to do a live.
Would you like to attend a live taping with the three of us?
With listener engagement through the live taping,
I
right?
think so.
Space for questions and engagement.
Yeah.
Could be fun.
Could be
man.
fun. We're just throwing it out there. Not promising anything, no dates or times yet, but we would love to gauge that interest.
We'd have to gird our loins for that, though.
We
think
would
so.
definitely need to gird our loins.
I think so.
Oh my. Well, yeah, we'll have to be some of our pre-turning on the episode conversations.
Yeah. Might actually have to prepare something.
man.
God forbid.
All right. Well, there you have it. Next week, we will get through all of 2 Samuel. That's our promise to you for next week. Until then.
On to, I don't even know what's after Samuel. Kings?
Kings.
Man,
More kings.
I'm ready to be done with Kings and Samuel and Chronicles and all of that.
But we're not going to be for a while.
I know.
There's a lot of Hebrew scriptures.
As Rick says, gird your loins. You got a lot left.
All right. And we'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot Van Hoy.
And Natalie Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalie Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org. Ghost mistress? I want to be a ghost mistress.